Hello, my name is Pam Machuga. I'm a park ranger here at Cuyahoga Valley National Park, and I wanted to share our lesser known stories of the national parks. Now, this one came about specifically because when we were doing our Cuyahoga Valley National Park Untold stories, it made us think that there are a lot of national parks that people aren't as familiar with, and a lot of national park stories that people aren't as familiar with. So we wanted to share a few of those. Our essential theme question is, what do the stories we preserve say about us as a society? Really trying to get towards the fact that we tend to preserve certain stories, and I will say probably, stories of dominant culture. So how can we uncover those lesser known stories? So to invite people in, our green level question is, what is a fun fact that people don't know about you? And we usually populate this. I always put that I twisted on stage with Chubby Checker, and then hardly anybody knows who Chubby Checker is. So go Google that, right? But it gets us to thinking and to having conversations with people around the fact that there's a lot that you don't know. You don't know what you don't know, right? So, how can we explore some of the lesser knowns or the unknowns in the national park? So, we have a lot of National Park Service sites that we preserve here that we're going to share, but we don't want to overwhelm people. So, we usually ask them, is there something that strikes you that you would like to learn a little bit more about? So, I will be that person. I think I would like to learn a little bit more about this gentleman. So this is Saint Gaudens. He was an artist, and he did everything from little teeny cameos to huge monuments. And the cool thing about him is what he loved to preserve was history. So he preserved historic events, moments, people. And one of my favorite pieces of art that he has is the Shaw Memorial. And if you've ever been to downtown Boston, I actually was visiting downtown Boston. I'm just walking around the corner in the Capitol, and I look up and it's there, and it is life size. So this commemorates the colored troops that Shaw um, was in charge of his regiment during the Civil War. And kind of the cool thing to me about this, first, it was the first time that they gave legitimacy to African Americans who were fighting in the Civil War in a monument of some sort. But what I thought was really cool is that the individual faces, right? The soldiers, the individual faces, back at this time, you would make one cast molding and you would use that for every single face. But thank Gaudens wanted to make sure that each individual personality came out. So each of these faces was cast from a different individual, which I thought was really cool. Now, after we share a little bit about each of our sites, we like to ask a dialogic question. And these are going to be yellow or even red dialogic questions. So this one is, if you could honor a historic event, what would you choose? And it's not something that people have to answer. It's something that they can just consider. We've had a lot of people having conversations within their own groups about the dialogic questions. Okay, so, let's do this one. So this is Charles Young. So Charles Young was a Buffalo soldier, but before he was a Buffalo soldier, Charles Young was only the ninth person admitted into West Point, and he faced a lot of barriers because he was an African American man, and so it took him 2 years to do that freshman year. But after 5 years, he graduates, and he's actually put in charge of some regiments that are going to be working out in national parks because before we had park rangers in our lovely little uniforms, the military took care of a lot of our national parks. And there is a tale that when one of the African American troops was out there, some American Indians said that the hair resembled that of the buffalo. Not sure if that is a true story or not, but the tale goes that that's how they became known as Buffalo Soldiers. They did fantastic work out in the parks. He becomes a superintendent, the first African American superintendent at the parks out west. I think Grant and Sequoia. And then the question is, what would you like to be remembered for? Because some people remember him for being a Buffalo Soldier, but eventually he is invited back to teach at Wilberforce, and he taught military tactics there. And today, Charles Young Buffalo Soldier National Monument is actually based out of Wilberforce, which is a historically black college in Ohio. So that's kind of a fun one there. Um, Over on this side, we have the Nez Perce, And this one has a map that is going to show the journey. So this this group actually, the United States military was trying to get them to sign a treaty that would make them give up 90% of their land, and they didn't want to do that. So they end up going on this incredibly long journey um, towards Mexico. I'm sorry, toward Mexico, towards Canada. And the last spot right here, they almost made it to the Canadian border, but they could not quite make it. Not all of them. A few hundred made it across, and the rest were taken back. And so the question is, what would you be willing to risk for your freedom? And so all along the way, there are monuments to that flight. This is Stonewall National Monument. This is in New York, and this one really honors the fact that LGBTQ individuals started fighting for their rights in the 1960s, much more so than previous years. And what was happening is in New York, they would raid premises where they thought people were gathering who were LGBTQ, and you could be arrested, right, and thrown in prison. And so, on one day in particular, in the 1960s, in 1969, the police raided um, some of the establishments, but people, instead of running, they actually took to the streets and they protested. And it was not a nonviolent protest. There were metal and rocks thrown, but the LGBT community went from having a few groups that fought for their rights to having thousands of groups. So this is kind of like the 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 impetus for all of that. And the question that we have is, what would cause you to join a protest? Um, this over here, this is Women's Rights National Historical Site out in Seneca Falls, and this one I think is really particularly interesting because it is a National Park Service site that really preserves the story of the beginning of the women's rights movement, which actually came out of the abolitionist movement, just as years later the feminist movement comes out of the civil rights movement, which is kind of cool. So Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, these two women are actually traveling over in Europe where they meet. So Elizabeth Cady Stanton is on her honeymoon. She marries an abolitionist. They go over to Europe. The two women go to, of course, an abolitionist engagement, and they were really upset that women were not allowed to speak at this engagement. And so they talked to each other and they said, you know what, when we go back, we're going to make sure that we change that. And so in Seneca Falls in 1848, they signed the Declaration of Sentiments that really mirrors the Declaration of Independence, but includes women. Now, there was only one African American at this event, was Frederick Douglass. And so they kind of show how the women's right movement early on was racist. It was Eurocentric. All these women, predominantly that we've highlighted in the past, are of European descent, and it's regionalism. So mainly they were from the East Coast. They were affluent women, and they were white women. But it does give you a jumping off point to talk about a lot of the other women who were involved, like Ida B. Wells, was well known. She worked down south. She actually got run out of the South for writing articles about lynchings. African American woman. She goes to Chicago. She marries an abolitionist, and she becomes really involved in the suffrage movement. And so they're at this huge parade in the 1900s in Washington, D.C., and she is told that the black women cannot march in the parade at the front. They have to march in the back, or the Southern women who are advocating that they should get the right to vote to cancel out black men's vote, right? They say we won't march if the women are marching up front. And so Ida B. Wells waits until the parade kicks off and then she joins them right in the front, right? So this is a great kicking off point to talk about the diversity that you have in the women's rights movement. And then finally, we have right here some images, and there's some suitcases on the ground. This is Manzanar. And after the Japanese bomb Pearl Harbor, the United States government gathers up over 130,000 Japanese individuals, two-thirds who are United States citizens, and they give them 1 week to sell everything they own and pack the rest into suitcases and take them to internment camps. And people have to adjust to this life. And found some great articles, but also some really, really powerful videos that the United States government made, and they would play them before movies back in the 1940s. And it was like, look at the happy Japanese getting on the buses to go to their new homes. I mean, it was incredible propaganda, right? So our question in front of our little suitcases down there is, if you had to leave behind everything and could only take what fit into a suitcase, what would you bring with you? Right? So, our hope is that in exploring these, people will appreciate the lesser known stories of America's national parks. Maybe they'll find a place where they fit into these stories. So, the stories aren't just about whoever's in charge and in power, but the stories reflect the diversity of Americans, which is what national parks should do, because we are the parks for everyone. So, we should share everyone's story. Thank you so much.